All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something, well, I guess a lot of us probably struggle with, and that's really understanding how change happens, especially when things, aren't always so straightforward. So less like following a set recipe and more like, I don't know, maybe putting on our detective hats.
Yeah, exactly. Becoming like knowledge detectives, trying to piece together what actually went down,
Yeah.
the clues, the trail, all that.
Exactly, yeah. And the method we're going to unpack today to help us do that is called outcome harvesting.
Outcome harvesting, right?
All right.
And the main source we're diving into for this one is a 2012 document. It's called the Outcome Harvesting Brief.
Okay.
And it was supported by the Ford Foundation's Middle East and North Africa office. Pretty interesting stuff. It really lays out kind of like the basics, the concepts, and even practical steps for how to actually do outcome harvesting.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then, we really want to get under the hood of outcome harvesting, right? Understand what are the core principles behind it? What are the steps involved? Why is it so valuable? And especially, I think this is key, why is it so useful in those situations where, things are complex, where it's not just a straight line from A to B?
Yeah, definitely. And, it all comes down to answering some pretty fundamental questions, right?
Yeah.
What actually happened? Like concretely, what changed? Who was involved in making that happen? What's the evidence for these changes? Why do these changes even matter? And then, okay, so what? What do we do with all this?
Yeah.
How does it inform what we do next?
So many good questions in there. So let's start unpacking this a little bit. So when is outcome harvesting most useful? The brief makes it pretty clear that it's, especially handy when we're really focused on outcomes, right? Not just activities.
But outcomes, not just like, oh, we had this many meetings, we published this many reports. It's like, what was the actual effect of all that? What actually shifted in the real world?
Exactly, yeah. And the brief even calls out some specific examples like advocacy, campaigning, policy work, like those kind of things, right?
Absolutely. Because those are the kind of areas where things can get so messy. There are so many factors at play, so many moving parts. Trying to draw a straight line from cause to effect, forget about it. It's
Yeah.
nearly impossible.
Yeah. So outcome harvesting, it gives you this different way of understanding what progress actually looks like in those contexts.
And it's not just a tool for looking back after the fact, either, like a postmortem or something. The brief is clear that outcome harvesting can be used for like real-time monitoring, so you get that constant feedback loop about what's being achieved as you go.
Yeah.
But it can also be used for different forms of evaluation, like whether you're trying to course correct along the way or looking back at the overall impact of your work.
So adaptable. It can be woven throughout the whole life cycle of an initiative.
Right, exactly.
So let's talk about strengths. What makes outcome harvesting so powerful? I mean, one thing that jumps out to me is that it's actively looking for unintended results. It's not just about what we plan for.
Yeah, huge advantage there. Like a lot of times traditional evaluations, it can feel like they have blinders on. They're so focused on those predefined goals that they miss all the other ripple effects, both the good and the bad. So outcome harvesting is designed to catch those, to cast a wider net.
Yeah, and it's not just based on, people's stories or whatever, right? These outcomes that are being harvested, they have to be verifiable. There has to be actual evidence that the change happened.
Evidence-based for
Yeah.
sure. You're grounding it in something tangible. And the brief even makes the point that the whole logic of the approach is pretty straightforward, so it's actually easier to get people involved, those informants, the people with the firsthand knowledge of what went down.
Makes total sense. If it's a clear process, if it's logical, people are much more likely to engage with it in a meaningful way.
Right. And to get that information, they're not limited to one method either. The brief talks about everything from those in-depth interviews and workshops all the way to surveys, phone calls, email. They even look at documents. It's about using the right tools for the job.
That's cool. And it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach to how detailed those outcome descriptions need to be.
Right.
It's tailored to the specific questions that you're trying to answer.
Exactly. So you're not writing a novel every time you identify a change. The level of detail directly serves the purpose of the harvest. It's providing just enough clarity and context to actually be useful for the users of that information.
So we've talked about, when it's most useful, some of the strengths. What about limitations and challenges? What do we need to be aware of going in?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing the brief points out is that it does require a certain level of skill and time, to really put together those high quality outcome descriptions. You can't just scribble down a few bullet points and call it a day. You have to be able to articulate the essence of the change in a way that's precise and meaningful.
Yeah, it sounds like a real art to it, like capturing it in a way that's both concise and like carries the weight of what actually happened.
Totally. And you're also limited to the outcomes that those informants are aware of, right? Like if something really significant happened, but it flew under the radar, it's likely going to be missed.
Oh, that's an interesting point. So it really relies on the like knowledge and perspectives of the people you're engaging with.
For sure. And you absolutely need buy-in from those change agents, the people who are actually involved in influencing the outcomes. Like if they're not on board, if they're not willing to share, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, makes sense. And I bet for some people, that whole idea of like working backward from outcomes is probably pretty new, right? It's not how we're used to thinking about things. Usually it's like we have inputs, activities, and we hope it leads to the outcomes we want.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things. And the brief acknowledges that it can be a challenge for some people to wrap their heads around.
Okay, so we've looked at like the when, the why, the potential pitfalls. Let's actually dive into the nuts and bolts. Who are the key players involved in an outcome harvest?
Okay, so the brief identifies four main roles. You got the change agent, right? So this is the person or the organization actively working towards a specific change.
Right. And then you have the social actor. This is the person or the group, the community, whatever it is, whose behavior is actually changing, right? So they're the ones who are experiencing the outcome.
Exactly. And then you've got the harvest user. So this is the person or the group who's going to actually use the findings of the outcome harvest to, like, inform their decisions, their actions. It could be someone internal to the organization, like a manager or a director, or it could be an external stakeholder, like a funder or a partner.
And then, of course, you've got the harvester.
The harvester, yeah. The one running the show.
This is the person who like manages the whole outcome harvesting process. And a lot of times this is someone with like evaluation expertise, either internal or someone brought in from the outside.
Exactly. So they guide the process, facilitate that whole, gathering information from the change agents and everyone else, and they play a big role in analyzing and interpreting what comes out. So once you've got your players lined up, you move into the 6 steps of outcome harvesting. And the brief makes it clear that these are iterative, meaning they kind of build on each other, and you might go back and forth a bit.
Got it. Okay, so step 1, it's all about designing the outcome harvest. And this is where like the harvest user and the harvester get together and they define those like usable questions, right? These are the big meaty questions that the whole process is trying to answer.
Right, the driving questions. And the brief really stresses how important it is to like agree on what information you actually need to gather to answer those questions. So it's figuring out who changed what, when, and where did that happen, and how did the change agent contribute to that specific change.
And this is where that idea of the outcome description comes in, right? It has to be specific and measurable enough that it can actually lead to action.
Exactly. No vague hand waving, right? It has to be concrete and descriptive. And they also decide at this stage, like, what level of detail do we need for those descriptions? Do we just need a quick snapshot or a more in-depth, like, narrative with all the supporting evidence?
There's a great example in box 3 of the brief about a donor who wants to understand the collective impact of all their grantees on, like, making global governance more democratic. And the usable question they came up with is, what has been the collective effect of grantees on making the global governance regime more democratic, and what does it mean for the portfolio strategy? So that really sets the scene.
Right, sets the stage for sure. Because the whole point of outcome harvesting, it hinges on asking the right questions at the beginning, questions that'll actually drive decisions.
Exactly. Okay. Step 2, reviewing documentation and drafting outcome descriptions. So now we start getting into the nitty-gritty.
Right. So the harvester digs into, whatever documentation's available, reports, evaluations, press releases, anything really.
Right.
And they're looking for clues, right? Trying to identify potential outcomes and the activities that the change agent did. If there's not much in writing, they might need to go directly to the social actors.
Yeah.
Talk to the people who experienced the change.
So it's like detective work, right? Trying to piece together the story from whatever evidence you can find.
Totally. And based on this initial review, the harvester starts drafting those outcome descriptions. And they always include, like, the change itself, what actually shifted in the social actor, and how the change agent contributed to that, all at the level of detail they agreed on in step 1.
So there's that flexibility built in.
Exactly. In box 4, it gives a sample, a brief outcome description about the Palestinian Authority's work on revitalizing this employment fund. It outlines the change and the coalition's contribution that was working with the government.
Okay.
But then box 5 shows a more detailed version of that same outcome. So it adds layers of description, explains the significance a bit more, so you can really see how that level of detail can change depending on what you need from the harvest.
So flexible. And the brief also reminds us about the SMART criteria for outcome descriptions.
Yeah.
Specific, measurable, achieved, relevant, timely.
Super important. Yeah, it's like a checklist to make sure your outcome descriptions are solid, that they're clear, they're credible, they're useful.
Okay, step 3. Engaging with change agents to really flesh out those outcome descriptions.
This is where it gets personal. So the harvester sits down with the change agents, reviews those initial graphs, tries to see if there are any other outcomes the change agents are aware of, and then they work together to refine those descriptions. And the brief even mentions that, this can be a new experience for some change agents. They're used to reporting on activities, not necessarily the specific changes that result.
That's interesting. It's like shifting from what we did to what actually happened.
Exactly. And so there's this back and forth, this kind of ping-ponging of revisions between the harvester and the change agent to really nail down what happened and how the change agent played a role.
Okay, so box 7, it gives a draft outcome about this refund and then poses a bunch of guiding questions for the change agent to consider.
Yeah, those questions are so key. They help dig deeper, make sure you're getting to the concrete stuff and not just vague statements. And the harvester's really driving that, pushing for clarity and evidence.
It's like helping them connect the dots between their actions and the changes that happened.
For sure. And the brief also brings up confidentiality needs, which is really important.
Oh, right. Because sometimes, there might be reasons to keep some details under wraps, right?
Totally. Could be strategic, could be for safety reasons, all sorts of things. But even with those limitations, the outcome description still has to be specific enough to be verifiable.
Makes sense.
And then box 8 gives us this sample outcome harvesting questionnaire, gives you a taste of what kind of information is usually asked for, like who changed, what changed, when and where, and the organization's contribution to that change.
Okay, so it's pretty thorough.
Yeah, and it stresses the importance of reporting both intended and unintended outcomes, both positive and negative changes. And again, always being specific.
So being honest about the full picture, even if it's messy.
Exactly, no sugarcoating. And then box 9 has a sample outcome description based on change agent data. It's about the release of MB in Iran and the specific contribution of AWID. So it's a concrete example of how that information gets woven into the description.
I like that. It gives you a sense of what it looks like in action.
Yeah, exactly. And the brief also flags some common pitfalls to watch out for during this stage, like, mistaking an increase in awareness for an actual change in behavior or practice, or trying to claim full credit for an outcome when it was really a collaborative effort.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's so easy to get caught up in your own role and not see the bigger picture.
For sure. And sometimes it's not about what you did, but what you chose not to do, like preventing a negative outcome or being hesitant to report negative or unintended consequences.
Yeah, so it's about creating that space for honest reflection and reporting without fear of blame.
Exactly. Learning, not finger pointing.
Okay, step 4 is substantiation. This sounds super important for really making sure the findings are reliable. It's like double checking your work, right?
Exactly. It's about getting that independent perspective to validate what the change agent reported. So someone who's knowledgeable about the situation, but wasn't directly involved.
So a second pair of eyes to make sure you're not missing anything.
Yeah. And the brief mentions that even with a detailed report from the change agent, there's always a bit of subjectivity, So the substantiation process is like triangulating the information. You're looking at it from multiple angles to get a clearer picture.
Okay, that makes sense. And how do you choose who those substantiators are?
Well, it depends. It could be someone suggested by the change agent, other stakeholders who are familiar with the situation, maybe expert panels, or even a sample of individuals, depending on how big the harvest is.
Got it. And box 10, it gives us this sample format for requesting substantiation.
Right. So they ask the substantiator to say how much they agree with the outcome description and the change agent's influence. And they give space for comments. And those comments can be gold. They can highlight nuances, differences in perspective, things like that.
Oh, yeah, that's super valuable, hearing it from different angles.
Yeah. And even though you expect different viewpoints, it's not about negotiating opinions. It's about sticking to the facts.
Right.
What actually happened and what was the change agent's role in that. So then we move to step 5, analysis and interpretation.
This is where we start making sense of it all, right?
Exactly. So you've got these finalized, substantiated outcomes, and the harvester needs to organize them in a way that answers those usable questions from the very beginning.
Right, back to those big questions.
Yeah. So this could mean grouping the outcomes by strategic objective, region, year, whatever makes sense for the situation.
Okay, so you're creating like a framework for understanding the data.
Exactly. And the brief says that the analysis can happen at different levels too. You can zoom in on individual outcomes, zoom out to see all the outcomes one change agent achieved, or even look at the whole program with all the change agents involved.
Oh, wow. So you can get really granular or take that big picture view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for big initiatives, they even talk about using databases. Like Box 6 mentions a UN program that had so many outcomes, they needed a database to manage it all.
I bet. So many moving parts. And how do you actually analyze all this data?
Well, the brief mentions all sorts of techniques like weaving together different outcomes into stories using charts and visualizations, things like that. Figure 1 shows an example with women's inheritance rights. And Table 1 shows a simple way to analyze outcomes based on program objectives and the year they happened.
So it's about finding ways to make the data meaningful.
Right.
To see the patterns and connections.
For sure. But analysis is just the first step. Then comes interpretation, which is all about the so what? Like, what does this actually mean?
Ah, yeah. That's the key, right? Connecting it back to the bigger picture.
Exactly. And the brief brings back that example from Box 3, the one about democratizing global governance. It says the harvesters used their knowledge of these movements to interpret the outcomes they found. So it's about bringing in that outside knowledge and expertise to make sense of it all.
So you're not just looking at the data in isolation, you're connecting it to the real world.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to the final step, step 6, supporting the use of findings. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? Making sure that the information actually gets used.
This is what it's all about, right? Because the whole point of outcome harvesting is to generate those actionable insights.
Absolutely. So the harvester usually presents the findings to the harvest users as discussion points. And the users take that information, along with all the other factors they have to consider, like politics and budgets, to guide their decisions.
I like that. It's not about the harvester dictating what to do. It's about providing the information and facilitating the conversation.
Exactly. They're like a guide, not a dictator.
And Box 11 gives an example from a rights holders program where the harvester presented the outcomes by cost center, and suggested they have a discussion about cost effectiveness.
So it's bringing it back to those practical questions, right?
Yeah.
How do we use this information to improve what we're doing?
Exactly. So to wrap up this deep dive, outcome harvesting, it's a really valuable and, structured way to understand how change happens, especially when things are complex. And by focusing on the actual outcomes, not just the activities, it gives us this really powerful way to learn from what's happened, to see what's actually making a difference, and to make smarter decisions going forward.
It's about shifting our focus from what we intended to do to what actually changed. And that requires an open mind. We have to be willing to see the changes that are happening all around us, both the expected and the unexpected.
So it's about being curious, right? Being open to being surprised by what we find. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to ponder. How can you apply this idea of looking for actual changes, both expected and unexpected, to your own life, whether it's your personal learning journey or your work? What happens if you shift your focus from just checking things off your to-do list to really understanding the impact you're having, big or small? What might you discover? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into outcome harvesting.